By now, most of you already know that in 2.7, we will see the return of an old friend of ours, Tingyun. She was brought back to life by the genius Ruan Mei despite having seemingly been utterly destroyed. While I'm happy to see her return with a new look and even some new skills, there's something I've kinda wondered. Why exactly did they bring her back? I mean, let's be honest, as great as Tingyun is, she wasn't an important figure in the xianzhou, nor does she have any special powers that would make her revival worth the efforts of a genius. So why did Ruan Mei decide to save her? Well, as it happens, despite her rather uneventful past, right now, she might be a pretty key figure in the war against the aeons. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. Before we discuss this further, if you want to see more Honkai Star Rail content, do consider subscribing to the channel. Now, given this topic will cover most of the 2.7 story, it goes without saying that there will be a bunch of spoilers here. So if you haven't already played it, I suggest you do that first and come back to this video later. In 1.2, we learned through a rather surprising neck snap that our guide throughout our time on the xianzhou luofu has in fact been someone else entirely. The Lord Ravager Phantylia had captured Tingyun, disposed of her, and assumed her position aboard the ship. She did this to sow discord and incite chaos among the luofu to weaken them before launching an all-out assault. While the details of this story hasn't really changed, in 2.7, we learn a bit more about these events from the perspective of Tingyun and what happened right after her death. More importantly, we learn how she was resurrected despite having run into an emanator of destruction. You see, most that meet the Lord Ravagers end up experiencing a pretty quick death, as the Ravagers often use their powers to instantly destroy them, body and spirit included. With Tingyun, however, because Phantylia wanted to take all her memories, mannerisms, and experiences to better pull off her infiltration, she didn't destroy her entirely. Ruan Mei, who is the person revealed to be healing Tingyun, explains that because it wasn't instant annihilation, it meant that Tingyun didn't truly die, despite Ruan Mei also saying that both her body and spirit was destroyed. It's a little confusing, but Ruan Mei implies that enough was left over that she was able to bring her back. If she had truly died, then Tingyun would have been beyond even Ruan Mei's help. Ruan Mei then mentions that Tingyun's body has been contaminated with destruction or the ruined author's mark, and that she would have to live with it for the rest of her life. Because of this, she has had to make some modifications to Tingyun's body in order to ensure that the destructive energies remain under control. Now, this fact becomes very important later in the video, but it also hints at how the power of destruction might actually work. You see, on the surface, destruction might give you the impression that it's just an overwhelming force, something that utterly destroys anything it touches. I've personally viewed it this way because we've never really received any kind of explanation about it, but given what we learn here, destruction could instead just be a kind of energy. One that builds up, and only when it reaches a critical mass does it actually destroy its target completely. So maybe what's happening here is that Phantylia forcibly imbued Tingyun with enough destruction energy to functionally kill her, but not destroy everything about her, leaving her memories and psyche supposedly intact. That's why despite Ruan Mei stating that her body and spirit was destroyed by Phantylia, there was still some lingering part of her that she could still bring back. This might also explain why Tingyun's body now holds some of destruction's energies, as it perhaps never reached the critical mass needed to absolutely destroy her. Destruction might actually be a status effect that only disintegrates you once you reach 100%. Tingyun herself kinda hints at this, as her current state of existence is like a constant tug of war between herself and the marks of destruction dwelling within her. This largely explains how she was able to be brought back, but doesn't really clear up the why. Well, as it happens, while Ruan Mei was conversing with Tingyun while she is in the rejuvenation tank, she reveals that the only reason she did this was to repay a debt she had owed to an unnamed traveling merchant. Now, this merchant could be practically anyone, and it's not outright mentioned in 2.7 who it actually is, but it's very likely that it's Luocha. I mean, Luocha has referred to himself as a traveling merchant, and despite Ruan Mei having no ties with Tingyun and thus no reason to save her, Luocha might actually have one. The last we heard of Luocha, he was with Jingliu on their way to see the Marshal of the Xianzhou Alliance to discuss their godslayer protocol. You know, the plan Jingliu hatched to kill off the Aeons. What if the reason Tingyun was safe is not because Luocha is fond of her or anything, but really because she is actually an important part, maybe even a key part to the godslayer protocol? As we discussed earlier, Tingyun's body now essentially holds within it the Ruin Author's power. Perhaps this is what Jingliu and Luocha want. A vessel that holds the power of destruction itself, one that perhaps can be weaponized or used against the gods. Ruanmei herself mentioned that Tingyun wasn't completely destroyed, and maybe this made Tingyun into a completely unique individual. One that has the powers of the Ruin Author but no allegiance to the god of destruction themselves. This might be why Luocha and by extension Jingliu view her as worth saving, because if you think about it, there's really no other way you can get a hold of destruction's powers. The path is pretty much linked to its Aeon, and all his followers are devoutly loyal to Nanook. So Tingyun, at least right now, seems to be the only individual who has access to destruction and might be on the side of good, assuming all of this is true. Some of you might then wonder, how could destruction possibly destroy the Aeons? Well, Nanook's goal is the literal destruction of everything, so at some point, it likely has to turn the power of their path on the other Aeons. Kafka herself mentions that there is a future where Nanook wins, so for that to happen, the Aeons must have been killed in some way by destruction. This implies that destruction could likely be something that can actually kill these space gods. But if you prefer a more sciencey explanation, perhaps destruction energy, or whatever you want to call it, is literally just antimatter. And you know how destructive antimatter is when it comes into contact with regular matter, right? This still fits within destruction's lore and ethos, as there are quite a few references to antimatter among the destruction factions. Their main faction is called the Antimatter Legion. Some of their units are mentioned to comprise only of antimatter, and even one of their Lord Ravagers was said to have turned an entire planet into antimatter. So it could be that what is in Tingyun's body right now is really just an endless sea of antimatter. So maybe throughout all this time, Jingliu and Luocha have been gathering up remnants of the Aeons in order to weaponize them or use them against the gods, since only a god can kill another god. They have a piece of Tezeron's body, and now with Tingyun, they also have an individual with a body filled to the brim with the power of destruction. What makes this even more interesting is that Tingyun herself and even some in the Alliance believe this to actually be the case. When Tingyun prepares to leave Penacony, she meets up with an old friend who has come to bring her back to the luofu, Yukong. As they catch up, Tingyun asks Yukong an important question: whether or not she actually has to return to the luofu. This of course perplexes Yukong, but as Tingyun explains, like most of us, she herself doesn't understand why she was saved. While she's grateful that she has been given another chance at life, Tingyun can't help but wonder whether this was a big giant coincidence or it was something purposefully planned. She even admits to feeling like a pawn with all these things happening not due to anything in her control, but rather because of the machinations of some unknown person. She's almost implying that someone wants her to be in this state that she currently is in. What ties this with the entire Jingliu and Luocha idea is that when Tingyun mentions this, Yukong pretty much corroborates it. She mentions that some in the Alliance certainly believe this to be the case and that the suspects are currently on the Yuchui, the same ship Jingliu and Luocha are currently on. But these coincidences don't stop there. You see, with her newfound blessing, Tingyun now believes that she should use them for a more specific purpose, to make the gods pay. Through her rather harrowing experience, she realizes that the gods have always made pawns of them, allowing suffering and pain to be inflicted on humanity endlessly and without choice. This outright enrages her, and why instead of returning to the luofu, she requests Yukong to get General Jingyuan to set up an audience between herself and the xianzhou marshal. While she claims this meeting is to figure out whether her new condition can be used against the enemies of the Alliance, it just so happens to also put her on a direct collision course with Luocha and Jingliu, which can't possibly be a coincidence. Either Jingliu and Luocha knew this would happen, or fate itself is conspiring against the Aeons. Plus, when Ruanmei rebuilt Tingyun, she herself mentions that she had to modify her body somewhat. Who's to say she didn't implant this idea into Tingyun's head, compelling her to have a hatred for the gods and seek out the marshal. Even if that weren't the case, despite having never met Jingliu or hear about her plans, Tingyun's intentions seem pretty much in line with Jingliu at this point. By wanting to weaponize her stored destruction energy or whatever it is, she also looks to bring the aeons down a peg and make them pay for the pain and suffering she and those she cares about have experienced. So to summarize, it seems that Tingyun might now be imbued with destruction's powers and is looking to channel it towards the enemies of the Alliance, specifically the Aeons. While all this seems to align quite nicely, it could still just be a giant coincidence. Perhaps while Tingyun, Jingliu, and Luocha are walking on a parallel path with the same end goal, maybe their journey will ultimately end up being different. Luocha still likely has Tezeron's divine body, and we don't really know what the godslayer protocol even is, so perhaps their plan isn't connected to Tingyun at all. Alternatively, Tingyun might also have a different plan altogether. I mean, she does kinda somewhat suggest this. Maybe with her connection to destruction, she instead wants to infiltrate destruction and perhaps turn them into fighting the other gods, kinda like what Zemo did in Civil War. It would be pretty poetic if she did indeed do this, as that's what Phantylia was trying to do with her home. It could also be that she is somehow linked to destruction in some way that perhaps the xianzhou can exploit. With how much damage Phantylia caused the luofu, I'm sure they are more than happy to get some payback. Whatever the case may be, Tingyun seems to now be on a completely different path from her past life, one that might converge with Jingliu and Luocha or deviate from them entirely. While their plans might differ, it's still very likely that Luocha was the one who did indeed request Ranmei to help her. If she does manage to severely cripple destruction from within and give Phantylia a taste of her own medicine, it would likely make one hell of a story. Either way, she will likely get her revenge, as Tingyun so eloquently put it, a Foxian always gets even. With that, I'll end the video here. Do you think Tingyun might team up with Luocha and Jingliu? Is she being manipulated? Or will we have Tingyun become John Wick in the future? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed watching the video, do consider liking and subscribing to the channel. Thanks so much for watching, and as usual, have a nice day.